Lecture will cover some basic terminology and show some examples of different elements of map layout, specifically looking at concepts of hierarchy, alignment, balance, figure-ground relationship, etc. As you begin making maps in a more systematic and more professional manner, some of these elements in our map layout will be of importance to consider and to keep in mind. So with that said, I'll go through some of the various terminology that relates to the layout design. So the first one is the concept of the visual hierarchy. And really the visual hierarchy is kind of the graphical implementation of that order of importance of your elements that you're mapping. So in most cases, we break this up into the idea that we have our prominent data that we're mapping, our secondary data, our geographic context, and then our background information. And those are really kind of the four basic steps within the visual hierarchy. And then from each of those, there's kind of additional sub-components. So for example, in this map here, this map is illustrating the proportional size of urban populations on coastlines as opposed to the interior of the United States, as a way to kind of demonstrate potential vulnerabilities to sea level rise or climate change or factors like that. So in this case, we can see that the hierarchy of the data that we're trying to map is coastline cities, interior cities is the secondary data, the continental United States, with the subsections of Alaska and Hawaii is the geographic context or the geographic area that we're mapping, and then just the page dimensions that contains our title and legend and all that auxiliary information is our background. So in this case, we can see the visual hierarchy of the red for the coastline cities, then the muted kind of light purple for the secondary data, and then the light canvas for the United States geographic area is demonstrating that visual hierarchy and matching that data hierarchy. So then when you say visual hierarchy, what we're really trying to do is to match visually with the hierarchy or the order of our data and geographic information. The next concept is the map layout, and this is simply the ordering of the map elements on the XY dimensions of the visual field. So if we think about our page layout as the visual field that we're working on, then its map layout is really just the ordering and the alignment of those elements within that page. So there's some different ways that we can do that. We can use grids, both symmetrical and asymmetrical grids, right, where everything in a symmetrical grid is proportionally aligned throughout the map. And then an asymmetrical grid, we still have those vertical and horizontal lines that everything's aligned to, but then there's a little bit more imbalance within the page itself. And oftentimes an asymmetrical grid will be the result of looking at or mapping a unique shape. For instance, if we mapped Michigan as a state, that has a lot of non-square spaces that you're working with, right? And so in that case, you have a lot of asymmetry because the geographic unit that you're mapping has a asymmetrical shape. Whereas if you're mapping Colorado, for example, being a square state, or you're mapping a county that's on the grid system, then you might have a very square shape, a very symmetrical shape. Then the rest of your page alignment would try to match that symmetry. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that concept of symmetry and keeping things on these vertical and these horizontal grids. And a concept that we try to minimize within that is the idea of sightlines. And sightlines are really kind of the horizontal and the vertical lines that we try to align the different map elements to. So the fewer sightlines we have, or the fewer vertical and horizontal planes that we have that our information's aligned to, the better. The more that we have, the more kind of like convoluted and just disjointed our map visual product becomes. Whereas if we have a minimum number of sightlines that our elements are aligned to, then it becomes a much more visually cohesive thing to look at. You can see this is going to be the assignment that you're working on in this lab. And you can see that I've put the grid lines in here in order to facilitate a certain level of alignment of my elements. And this is what you'll do in your lab as well. This is a good map that demonstrates good alignment and a reduction of sight lines. You can see, even all these elements in the top, they're all aligned along this horizontal plane, or the elements on the side here all aligned on this vertical plane. Same here. Right, so you really want to try to focus when you have textual elements, graphical elements, your legend, scale bar, titles, all those things, to really try to keep those in alignment, and so they can really frame and contain that geographic space that you're mapping. And another concept we talk about often is the figure-ground relationship, and this is really that relationship between your foreground data and your background geographic context, right? And in this case, what we really want to do is try to find ways, whether it's through color, texture, shape, size, other sorts of visual variables, to bring forward the data that we're trying to highlight, and then to set that against a subtle backdrop so that our data can really stand out against that background. And that's what's known as the figure-ground relationship, that relationship between the foreground and the background. A simple demonstration of that is just through this map of, I think these are NATO countries or some sort of European Union thing, I'm not sure. But you can see that in this case, Germany is our prominent data country, so that stands out visually. Then we have our secondary data, which is the rest of these countries within this international alliance, whatever that international alliance is. And then we have that in the backdrop against the other countries, right? The grayed out countries that are not part of this alliance. And then that is even on top of the oceans, which we've made white. So in this case, we can clearly see what our primary data is, our secondary data, and our broader context. And if in this case you had a dark blue ocean as your backdrop, then that would distort that figure-ground relationship and kind of mess up that visual hierarchy that you're trying to go for. You'll do an example of this in the mini lab this upcoming week. Each lab has a two-part section. One's kind of like a mini exercise where you do a little discrete skill that takes 15-20 minutes. And then you have a larger lab that has a little bit more complex stuff to it. And in your mini lab this week, you'll be making just a simple locator map that highlights some of this kind of like figure-ground relationship stuff. Another way to think about the visual hierarchy and the figure-ground relationship is really kind of, creating an outline. Sometimes I do this before I'm making a map, is just try to think about all my different elements that I have within that page layout and put those into some sort of order in terms of their importance of what I'm trying to demonstrate and to highlight. And then from that can allow me to kind of visualize what that hierarchy is and to establish that figure-ground relationship quite well. Okay, and then another concept, there's two different types of kind of map layout flows that we use in cartography. One is known as the compartmentalized layout. And in the compartmentalized layout, that places the different components into their separate, often boxed or often sequestered compartments. So for example, you can make this map here of Cuba, maritime zone, and limits, and then in each of these textual explanations, graphics, your legend, your locator map, each of those are in different compartments or they're different containers, right? So this is what's known as a compartmentalized layout. And there's certain situations where a compartmentalized layout is effective. If you're trying to show clarity between these graphical or these data elements and the geographic elements, sometimes if there's a lot of busyness or noise, it can be helpful to try to compartmentalize your elements so that they have a little bit more clarity, or there's a little bit easier to read as related to the rest of the background information. But that's a compartmentalized layout. In contrast, and what I often try to strive for is a fluid layout, and that's a layout that kind of gets rid of some of those sharp containers or those sequestered containers and tries to integrate your different additional text or graphic or locator map or legend elements into the flow of the whole product. So this is a good example of a fluid design, with the exception that it does have this compartment over here that is containing the kind of broader locator map. So even this, you can see how the rest of this has pretty good flow. There's elements that are kind of integrated into the design. You have nice kind of dynamics about the wave formation, stuff like that here. You know, some textual explanations. And then this compartment up here kind of sits there in contrast to the rest of the map, and I don't know if it's very effective. So this is a good example of, you know, a fluid design being used in most of the map, and then a compartment kind of being over here in the corner. Then that flow, for me, doesn't usually work. Sometimes it can, but that's something to keep in mind, is like when you're making these choices, to be intentional about them and to be thoughtful about, why am I putting this compartment of this information? Why am I sequestering that over there? Is there a reason? Or is that just kind of like what I'm doing by default and not really contemplating whether it should be more of a fluid or more of an integrated design? And here's a good example of another integrated design, right? This is showing recent wildfires in Northern California, and then demonstrating, you know, a particular fire, the Caldor fire, and then showing, you know, a locator map and some additional burn severity and fire progression, legend information and stuff like that. Smoke from the wildfires, etc. And this is a good fluid design because all of these different elements are all kind of integrated together. You can even see some overlap here between kind of the background terrain topography and the textual and the explanations of the different visual elements that are being used. So this is a nice fluid design. So, you know, whenever you're making a map, one of the things I think about first is like, can I achieve a fluid design? And if not, then like, in what ways should I compartmentalize different data elements or different graphical elements in order to achieve the most readability for my audience? And then another thing that we try to do is create a sense of balance in our map. And this is really thinking about ways that we can make sure that the visual weight of our elements are kind of equally distributed and placed throughout the map in a way that provides harmony. So not one side is kind of overweighted and the other side is lacking, or vice versa. We don't want the top to be completely filled with information and the bottom be sparse and you know, not have the same kind of density of things. You know, and there's different times where we try to find a very strict balance, and other times where we try to weight things to one side or weight things to the other based on what we're trying to communicate. So here's a good example of good balance in the map. And this kind of, if you divide this map in half this way, more or less, you can see that over here we have a large geographic feature that takes up, you know, a large portion of half the map here. Then we have some small elements, a locator map, a textual paragraph explanation of the area, some legend stuff. You know, that takes up kind of one half the map here and creates fullness over here on the left hand side. Then we move over to the right, then we have a bunch of different input variables to create the larger model. So these are all, you know, different elements that's going into this site suitability fish habitat restoration map, and then some different data graphics associated with it. So from that, even though there's not necessarily symmetry in the size or symmetry in the weight of the different elements, as this one's being quite large and prominent, where this has a bunch of small elements that are compiled together, there is pretty good balance, generally speaking, because you have kind of filled this space pretty systematically with good alignment over on this side, right? Good alignment here. And then kind of married that over here to many elements that are still all in good alignment and all have their kind of totality of their features kind of adds up to the same as the totality of these features. So that's one thing you want to try to keep in mind, is like, if I'm dividing my map page layout into halves or into thirds, right? Sometimes we use the rule of thirds like in photography. You know, how can I achieve kind of equal weighting on all those different thirds or all those different halves. So balance is something that we try to strive for. It's not, we're not mapping square and symmetrical features often. Oftentimes we're mapping geographic features that have unique shapes and unique sizes and non-symmetrical elements to them. So that can make that idea of balance a little different than in other forms of graphic design, because we are kind of tethered to a geographic element that we have to maintain fidelity to. But then because of that, then it gives us a little opportunity for more creativity with how we're going to fill out the rest of the page in order to achieve that balance. And here's another good example of balance in maps. You can look at any National Geographic cartographic product, and most of them have pretty good balance based on graphic design variables. You can see in this one, this is our geographic area of focus here, right? This mountain range that is fragmented, or this habitat that is fragmented. And it's because of that really takes up kind of this half of the map and kind of the top third of the map. Then there's other elements that are kind of balanced within that in order to create fullness, some negative space over here that the map can rest into, some space over here that the map can rest into, so it doesn't feel cluttered or crowded, but there's still kind of a nice balanced feel to it. So, it's something that is kind of, balance in cartography is difficult to have strict rules for, just because, like I said, there's a lot of asymmetry and uniqueness of landscapes that we are mapping, so that makes kind of rigorous rules about how to balance our products less informative than in other types of design. So we really have to think about what are the different elements that we're trying to include in the map, whether that be locator maps, titles, text elements, institutional graphics, scale bars, legends, citations, labels, color features within our map, background, etc., etc. How are we taking all those components together, deciding what elements need to be compartmentalized, like this one here, which ones need to be kind of fluid within the flow of the entire design, and then from that, think about how we can situate our maps so that they achieves balance. One way to think about that with this map in particular, since this map has kind of the shape that starts here and swoops around, right? So it has both a vertical and a horizontal element, but those aren't necessarily in a normal shape. One could be tempted to center the geographic element of the map, right? If that was here, and then you would have a lot more challenges to try to figure out how am I going to put all these other elements around a centered object, where in this case, since the main geographic element is pushed to the left side and taking up kind of this left-hand side of the map, then it allows us all this space on the right-hand side of the map where the geographic feature is not prominent or not important, right? So this is our main geographic feature. Since it kind of swoops over to the right like this, it leaves all this negative space here that we can then use to fill in with our different cartographic elements that we want to achieve. Here's a good example of bad balance, or a bad example of balance, I guess. Here we're having a map that's showing kind of the push and pull factors of NATO and of Russia, and how they're kind of intersecting in Ukraine, and how it has to do with energy, and there's all this information about Ukraine's history here, and there's a locator map, and there's a little title, and there's flow lines going everywhere, and there's another data graphic down here, and another data graphic down here. And it's just kind of come to the point where there's so much information in this map that even though it's all good information and all probably important information in understanding the geopolitical complexities of Ukraine, because of its design and the imbalance of the features and the clutterness and like the lack of spacing for some of these different elements to breathe, it becomes quite difficult to read. And so this is a good example of trying to do a little bit too much with a map, and from that we start to lose some of those kind of like balance and flow components that makes not only a map informative but like visually pleasing and easy to read and captivating to your audience. So this is a good example of kind of trying to do too much or having too much data and trying to cram that all into one space. And then the last concept, negative space. This is when you're making any sort of graphic, you have active space that's being used by your different elements, whether that's your geographic elements or your text elements or your legend elements or north arrows or whatever. Those are all active spaces. And then we have negative spaces. That's the portion of the visual field or the portion of the page layout that is not being used by graphical elements. So it's important to balance visual active space and visual negative space. And again, that will allow you to achieve a higher level of readability, to allow your features to kind of sit within the map frame or within the page layout, as opposed to just like it feeling like it's crammed into a container that's too small for it. At the same time, you don't want too much negative space, because then if you have so much negative space that it kind of is at equal balance with the geographic features that you're trying to map, then your page looks sparse and incomplete. So again, it's one of those things that there's not really like steadfast rules, but there's just kind of a balance or a practice of trying to use active and negative spaces in order to achieve harmony in your maps. So here's a good example of negative spaces being used in this map of Michigan. Like I said before, Michigan is a unique landscape to map, in that it has two different fragmented parts, even a third up here if you include Isle Royale. It has lake features, it has another country, another state, that all kind of within this square page layout that you might make for a report or for a poster or some sort of document. You have a lot of active spaces of Michigan that you're mapping, and also a lot of inactive or background spaces that you're trying to map, that you want to give visual context to. You don't want this just to be white, for instance, because then Michigan might just stand on itself and it just kind of floats in space. So this grounds the state itself within the broader geographic area in a pretty visually appealing and captivating way. But it creates a lot of space that you have to kind of attend to, right? And so in this case, you have a lot of negative space here, and this map does a really good job of making this background information, making the terrain visible, but making the colors of it muted and desaturated, as opposed to the land cover map of Michigan. And then having this little legend over here in the corner just kind of allows for a lot of space on the left side and on the top right side, so that Michigan itself is kind of balanced within the broader page layout. Here's another good example of negative space. Sometimes, creating negative space or creating that kind of container for your map to fit into, all it really takes is just having this kind of like symmetrical neat line around the map, right? So that your geographic map frame, this here, kind of sits within a bordered area of your page layout. And one of the best ways to do that with a lot of maps, especially ones that have this vertical orientation like this, is to create three sides of symmetry with a neat line, and then the bottom kind of be 3 times that big, so that it kind of fill in with different titles or different sort of other information. So again, this is negative space as defined by the background terrain or background geographic context, and then here's negative space being implemented into a design through the use of neat lines or white boundaries. Okay, and so